to episode 34 of Anatomy of Tone. I'm Mark Marshall, your host. This week we're going to discuss a microphone that I've recently discovered, which was designed specifically to record guitar amplifiers, and I'll get more into that. It's a wonderful discovery because it's something I've always struggled with, at least with dynamic mics, and finding one that I really liked to put really close to the grill, either for studio usage or live performances. Before we get into that, I just want to mention that you can check out my website, anatomyofguitartone.com, where I also have a lot of discussions on gear, as well as some information about composition and recording. I have a contact page there where you can reach out to me if you want to discuss taking private lessons. I teach private lessons in guitar and bass composition, music theory, recording and production, a lot of the same subjects I teach in college at SUNY Purchase, but one-on-one interaction to be able to cater to each person's specific needs and questions and tastes. If you dig in this podcast, please review me. It does help the algorithm. I'm old-fashioned in the sense that I record real guitar amps still to this day. I have experimented a lot with using devices like the Universal Audio Aux, which for what it does is very good, but it still lacks something when it comes to a real amp. And I've tried a bunch of devices such as the Strymon Iridium and other amp modelers and UAD amp sims, and I just look, sometimes you have to use those things, and you can make great music with them. It doesn't mean you can't make great music, but there is a difference in the touch sensitivity, and I would say the three-dimensional character that exists with a real amplifier. They just haven't been able to truly emulate that yet. And so for that reason, I still prefer to set up an amplifier with a couple of microphones in it to record it, because a lot of times I'm making recordings that I want to be a document for a very long period of time. So I'm very concerned with the quality of all the sounds that are getting printed into Pro Tools. Now I realize everybody doesn't have this availability, and as I mentioned, again, you just have to find ways to make music any way you can. But if you do, I encourage you to spend some time with some great microphones and amplifiers and listen to how it adds another dimension into your sound. I find I don't really have to fight with amps too much when I record them with a real microphone. Often when I'm using other devices, I spend a lot of time messing around with EQ, or just I'm unsettled. I'm trying to find a way to get that air into it, that third dimension that exists just simply with having the microphone up. And I have to fight the aux less than others, but there's still an air that is missing with that. So with that being said, we have to consider when we're miking an amplifier what mics to use to best complement that sound. And for a long time I've used ribbon mics. I have an AEA R84, which I love. Bayer M160s are great. Royer 121s or 122s are really fantastic microphones on guitar amplifiers. Ribbon mics just do really well with amps. But when it comes to dynamic microphones, it's been a real struggle. Shure SM57 has been, I would say, an industry standard for many, many years now. This has come to be the case, I think, partly because they're cheap and they're very durable. A lot of times you don't want to be handling a ribbon mic on a live gig. They're fragile, and also you have to be somewhat conscious of how many decibels your amp is putting out, because the SPLs after a certain point can damage ribbon microphones. The Shure SM57 is more robust in that regard. It can handle pretty high SPLs, but I don't know, it just is not my favorite sounding mic. It is a little brittle. I find if I put it in front of the guitar amp and center of the cone, it doesn't sound like I imagine my amp sounding. And this goes for hearing it back on gigs when it's in front of my cone or in the studio. You spend time getting your pedals and your guitar to match up well and complement each other when you're running into a specific amp that you're using, and then you hear it come back sometimes through a PA and it's not being represented, and it can be a little disappointing because you've spent a lot of time and knew without it being mic'd that it was really working. And it's because the SM57 is, I don't know, it's brittle. I guess I would say it could be a little harsh and it could be brittle on clean sounds and on fuzz sounds, and it's become a classic, and there's a lot of people that will still swear by it because it's become a classic tool, but it doesn't always mean it's the best tool. I feel the same way with snare drums, and SM57 has become a standard for snare drums because it's durable and cheap, so if somebody smacks it and it breaks, not to worry too much, it's replaceable, right, as opposed to a much more expensive mic. But I also don't like the way it sounds on snare drums, so I don't know, there's just better options now, which leads me to talk about the Tul G12 microphone, which I discovered. I was turned on to it by Kieran Kelly from the Buddy Project Recording Studio. Kieran's a great engineer and producer. And he had this Tul G12 microphone, which is made in Cape Town, South Africa, and it's designed to specifically work close proximity, center of the cone on a guitar amplifier, which is like right in the middle of the fire when it comes to sharp transients and brittle tones. You'll find that a lot of times when you stick a microphone here, it's really hard to place one there because it's just so bright and you get such a sharp transient. The Tul G12 uses a dynamic feedback circuit and it eliminates a lot of this harshness that we often get from sticking other dynamic mics right in front of the cone. Now, I should mention that I have also tried a lot of other dynamic mics in front of guitar amps. The 421 from Sennheiser, the 906, which was actually one of my favorites from Sennheiser. It was designed for guitar amps. It's a really nice mic, and it sounds more natural than most other dynamic microphones, such as the 57 and the RE20, 421, but it still isn't the best, I think, match with a lot of fuzz pedals and super clean sounds, particularly talking about like that, if we use the classic black panel Fender sound as an example, sticking a dynamic mic right in the center of the grill, you just hear so much of that transient. It's very sharp and fast. I find myself trying to counteract it some way during the mixing process. One thing I noticed about the Tul G12 is that I wasn't having these issues, and I'm sticking it in close proximity, right in front of the grill, the center of the cone, and it was wonderfully mellow yet articulate, and it didn't have any of that trashiness that I associate with a lot of other dynamic microphones. It gets rid of the fizz, and that's one of my main issues with the SM57 and many other dynamic microphones. When you stick it right on the grill like that, is it just it's hard to get that out. I spend a lot of time trying to use surgical EQ to get it out before I even add any shaping EQ, and the Tul G12 immediately eliminates that fizziness, and it takes EQ really well, so now I can just, if I want to, and I actually find myself EQing the G12 much less than I have other microphones. I can just add EQ as more of a color shaping tool rather than problem solving, and the G12 takes EQ quite well, and I think I would compare it to the way that a ribbon microphone takes EQ. If you've spent some time using ribbon microphones, you'll notice that one of the great advantages to using them is that they take EQ well. You can push the top end on them, they won't become harsh in a way that they do with dynamic microphones or condenser microphones. And the Tul G12 operates very much in that same manner. I can push the high end on the G12 without it becoming ice picky and sharp. And like I said, I'm impressed with how much avoiding EQ when using the G12, because it just puts the tone in the right place for me. And this is the case with using fuzz pedals like the Big Muff style fuzz pedals. You will hear later on, I'm going to give an example using my Vic Audio Ram's Head, which is one of the best sounding Big Muff reproductions. I feel like even with that, like just the style of that pedal, they could be a little bright and hard to capture. I always struggle capturing big muffs with microphones, especially dynamic microphones, and all of a sudden I'm using my signal chain into a Headstrong Little King, which is like the Black Panel Princeton amp, and put the G12 center of the cone, and it sounds awesome. And that's an achievement, I think, in my book. And I didn't add any EQ, it just sounded right. The G12 also has the option of a bright switch on it, so you can just go with like a neutral sound, or you could add a little presence into it. And I would encourage you to try the bright switch. Don't be afraid of it, because I know you think, oh, I'm using a guitar amp, I don't need anything to be any brighter. It's not bright in the way that you think it is. It's very flattering, and I was actually preferring it a lot of times with my cleaner amps, which I would normally be afraid to even consider using any kind of bright switch on a microphone in front of those amps, and it's just very flattering. It's great for the studio and live. I tend to work in both those mediums, and as I was mentioning, a lot of times I feel like my guitar amp sound is not being truly represented at the front of the house. I've started taking the G12 on gigs just to have there, and by the way, it comes in two styles. One is like this retro looking style, which I like because I feel like it just has a unique 1950s, early 60s look to it. But they also make it in the shape of like a Shure SM58 style body. Both of them come with the bright switch option, so you can experiment with those tones. It's interesting that I found a microphone that I feel represents my sound both in the studio and live. You know, in the studio, I'm still blending microphones a lot. I would say not all the time. I finally now with the G12, there's a dynamic microphone that I'd be happy just using one mic on the cab, but I still do like to pair it with a ribbon microphone or a condenser microphone just to pick up more range of the amplifier. So I'm a fan of multiple mics on guitar cabinets because I feel like it just picks up more of the air or that 3D dimension. I take care to make sure I'm placing the microphones in a place that I'm not going to have any phase issues, but I find that pairing the G12 with like a ribbon mic AEA RD4, it's just a very, very nice combination, very rich, articulate sound. You can even pair it with a 57, and for these examples I'm going to play, I did keep the G12 and the 57 really close to one another. I checked the phase and placed them much like how I would place a ribbon and the G12 and center of the cone. But I used the 57 and the G12 because I wanted to be able to compare those sounds, and I wanted you to hear how much more refined the G12 is, and how I would maybe use the term ratty the SM57 sounds. Some people are going to say, hey, the 57's been around for I don't even know how many years now. It's probably the 60s at some point. Why would we change now? And the reason is, look, we've made some advancements in technology, and it's nice to embrace them when they actually help you reproduce the sound you have in your head easier. I think easier is a key term here. There's less work that goes into it. I can spend more time making music rather than sitting with FabFilter open trying to figure out how to pull out those frequencies that are driving me nuts with the 57. I don't have to do that with the G12. I just put it up and I'm ready to go, and I'm not fighting with it. It just makes the process a little more seamless, and I can be creative rather than have to be troubleshooting a sound that isn't working. I think that's the key, right? The great gear allows you to, I don't know, not think about the gear, and it gets out of the way. And that's where it's always worth spending extra money to get nice gear, because it just makes the process more enjoyable. And that's exactly what the G12 does. By the way, you could check out the Tul website at tulmicrophones.com. I'm going to play a few examples now. The first example I'm going to play is a composition that I composed that was inspired by ska. So I play in a ska band called Bangari and the Socialites, which is inspired very much by Don Drummond and the Skylights, early ska music. We play a lot in Brooklyn at this place called Barbess, which is a gem of a venue in Park Slope that always has an interesting selection of eclectic music. It's known as like one of those spots that you go to hear really great people play and a wide variety of genres of world music. I had just done a gig with the Socialites on Friday night, so a lot of that music was fresh in my head, and I actually really love playing those grooves and that music. On the gear front, I was using a Fender Stratocaster that has FSC 1960s style pickups in it. That was running straight into a Headstrong Little King reverb, which is a black panel Princeton reverb with a 12-inch speaker in it. Now, I had the Tul G12 and the 57 in the center of the grill. This would normally not be the position I would put a microphone because I feel like the fast transient on the Headstrong matched with the mid-scooped tone of that era of the Fender circuit would not be a great match for the 57, but you'll hear that the Tul G12 just sounds lovely in that position, and it sounds like my amp does when I'm in front of it. Let's take a listen. Now let's compare that same performance using the SM57 on both guitar parts. Now, I didn't do any special trickery there or anything. You just hear that there's not as much body to the 57s, and there's something like brittle in the high end. It just feels like you'd have to do some extra work in the mixing process to make it sound more full or realized. I'm going to play a higher lead now so you can hear how the Tul G12 is responding to some higher notes on a Stratocaster, which can get a little brittle in these situations. Now, let's listen to that same performance using the Shure SM57. There's just something grating in that tone to my ears that drives me nuts a little bit, and this doesn't exist with the Tul G12. The G12 sounds nice and round, and the highs are clear but not poking my ear in a way that feels irritating, which I just absolutely love. Let me talk about the compositional process behind this first example. I started from the melody line perspective. I heard that melody line, the first one in particular, on the lower notes, and then I decided to harmonize the chords with it. So it all came from the perspective of the melody, and then I tried to figure out what chords can work over several groups of the notes, and a lot of it seemed to be based around an arpeggio, so it made it a little easier in this case to say, okay, well, the first couple of notes, they seem to be implying a C minor chord, and then the next couple of notes seem to imply G minor and then F minor, and so I just followed that and found what worked from there. And it turns out that once I got like a basic framework with it, I was able to consider tightening up a little bit with the cadence, right? So I had the C minor, G minor, F minor, right? 1, 5 minor. Well, the 1 is minor, the 5 is minor, the 4 is minor, and then I went to a diminished 2 to a dominant 5, back to the 1 again. And we have our 2-5-1 at the end of the cadence. One thing that's interesting in the first half of the riff, where I'm going from the minor 1 to the minor 5, is that minor 5 doesn't have as much of a push of a resolution to go back to that 1. So it's a little more chill, and you don't feel that big old like 5-1 cadence that is so strong in music. So that minor 1, minor 5, minor 4, it just feels a little bit more laid back in some ways. And at the end, when I use that diminished 2 chord and the dominant 5 chord, that really does have that push back to 1 again. So the diminished 2, the dominant 5 was something I thought about as I was working on the piece, because I knew I wanted to push back to that 1 chord. And it was a combination of starting off with like a melody line, and then once I had that, I was able to use some theory to think about a way to add punctuation or some finality to the sentence or the paragraph. To move on to the next example, which is using a Vic Audio 73 Ram's head. I really like this version of the Ram's head. I think it's the best one. It added a nice new feature onto it, which is basically like an EQ toggle where you can get a little more mid-range into the sound if you like, because the Ram's head or all the big muffs are a bit mid-range scooped, which is great, but sometimes having a little more of that mid-range in your signal can really be helpful in a gig and your guitar being heard, or just to sculpt your sound a little more. So it doesn't change the circuit, because you can have the original unaffected EQ curve of the 73 big muff, but you can also add a little more of those flattering mids into it. Now, the big muff, as I mentioned earlier, is just a hard pedal to capture depending on what amp you're using. Actually, any amp, but especially I feel like black panel Fenders, and it's been difficult even with such a high-end model such as the Vic Audio Ram's head, which by the way isn't super expensive, but the difference in quality between the Vic Audio and the Electro Harmonics version is pretty substantial. Just the quality of the enclosure, the components, the switches. The Vic Audio Ram's head is really made to last, and as opposed to the Electro Harmonics, which have a bit of, I don't know, durability issues would be a good way to say it. Now, recording the big muff, a 57 center of cone with an amp, recording a muff is just really can be aggressive and abrasive. But placing the Tul G12 there, I'm talking like right on the grill. The G12 is meant to be on axis center of the grill. It's not meant to be turned off axis or to be pulled too far away from the cone. It's really designed to be a close proximity microphone. And right in front of the center of the cone, and the big muff just sounded great. I didn't EQ it, which maybe is like the first time I've ever not EQ'd a dynamic microphone recording a big muff before. I used a Fender Telecaster that has Voodoo 52 pickups in it. I also paired the big muff with a Solo Dallas Schaefer Replica Storm pedal. I'm really digging this pedal as a preamp. It has a very specific coloration to it and very light limiting set in a specific way that I feel like just adds, I don't know, a little something extra special to the signal chain. I've been experimenting with combining with different pedals, and I really like it a lot. It's like the secret tone to like the Back in Black Angus Young sound, but it can do so much more than that. Even just using it in your signal chain, I'm using it at the end, so all my drive pedals run through it. I just found that it was a very nice pairing. It doesn't take away the harshness of the big muff, so you're going to hear even using the 57. It's not like the replica took away that abrasiveness. It helps, I would say, like enhance the big muff in a very flattering way, but it's really the G12 that is making it be represented in a recording in a way that doesn't feel like a chainsaw. That was the Tul G12 on the Headstrong Little King reverb, paired with the Vic Audio 73 Rams head and the Solo Dallas replica, the Storm pedal. Now, that was for the rhythm guitar part. For the lead guitar part, I was using a Rush pep box, and that was running straight into the Little King. And that's a very upper mid-range oboe-like sounding fuzz. It's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, early 60s and mid 60s fuzz tone that's still in production. I did a podcast about it 2 episodes ago. You should check it out because I really think this is a gem of a pedal that's made by the daughter of the original owner, and it's really special in that regard because it is authentic, truly down to its core. I use that for the lead guitar tone, so we have 2 fuzz pedals at the same time that tend to be a little tricky to record with dynamic microphones, and it just sounds great. Let's compare that now to that same performance with the 57. It sounds so much smaller and rattier and abrasive to my ears. I think there's a very discernible difference between those. And I should also mention that I had the Tul G12 on the bright mode on the microphone. And earlier I was saying don't be afraid of that bright switch, and there it is. There's a very bright source coming into that microphone, and it's still, even with the bright switch on, is completely flattering, and I added no EQ to it. These are, for both of these microphones, I didn't add an EQ. I just left them naked so that you can hear what they sound like in their raw state, as if you would be recording them and be ready to mix them. I want to discuss the compositional process behind that example. I took a different approach to that than the first one. So this example, I started out with this A chord, and I happened to play a partial G chord while still holding down that A chord. So if you're holding an A chord in first position, almost like a power chord, I was playing the third of the chord. So I was holding down the B string, the G string, and the D string, and it had the open A string ringing for the A shape. And I noticed if I kept that position, but then I put my middle finger on the low E string holding down a G, and then my ring finger on the B string holding a D note there, while still having the E and the A held down on the D and G strings. I really like that sound, and sometimes I would also put my pinky on the high E string to grab that G there as well. Just that chord, which I suppose you can look at that as being like a G9 6 chord or a G sus 2 add 6. It was one of those situations where I wasn't really thinking about the chord. I just found this sound and I liked it. I wasn't so concerned with technically what the chord would be called. And I feel like that's a disconnect sometimes when you're reading transcriptions and you're looking at the chord. You see all these funny names for chords and you're wondering, like, well, where'd that come from? And sometimes, of course, people are writing and they're intentionally using functional harmony and they're trying to write in chords for very specific reasons. But there's other times that we're just living in a sound world and finding sounds that work. And later on, we need a way to label them, to communicate them. That's exactly what happened in this example. I found this chord shape. And clearly, we hear that root note movement moving from A to G. So it's definitely some sort of G tonality. But I didn't get that deep into it, as opposed to just be able to tell you basically what the implication is of the harmony. For the B section, I was playing around with the pedal tone, which is a technique I like a lot, where you're just playing the same root note, or it could be a high note. Pedal tones, think of it as being a constant note that reoccurs but you could play different chords against it. In this case, I had the pedal tone on the open A string, and I was superimposing triads on top of it to create a tension, right? It creates a bit of an uneasiness until you return back to that original chord. So I started out with the A chord, so we're back at our A chord position, which is what the song started in, but then I moved the A shape up to a B chord, B triad with that A root note still happening, then up to a D triad with that A root still, and then an E shape with that A root note still resonating underneath. So it was A, then it was a B chord over an A root, then it was a D chord over an A root, then it was an E chord over an A root for a short period of time, 5-to-1 resolution. I just like the sound of moving chords against a static root note. There's a song called One Word from Tony Williams that has John McLaughlin and Jack Bruce on it, which I really love, and it's a masterclass in superimposing different chords over a root note, and I think it's fantastic. And also you could really think of these as a term would be like slash chords as well. I'm also a fan of polychords, of combining two chords on top of each other. That's not what I was doing here or what's happening in One Word from Tony Williams. This is more like slash chord movement or using a pedal tone to superimpose triads on top of it. In the B section, melody line, you can hear me highlighting the triad tones that I'm superimposing on top of that pedal tone A. I just really felt like the melody line wanted to follow more of the harmonic movement of those triads as opposed to it hugging the A root more, that pedal tone. There's just so many different ways we can approach composition and harmonization. You don't have to just apply one philosophy, and I encourage everybody, if you start with writing songs from lyrics, well, try writing a song just starting from a melody line, try writing a song starting from a bass line, try writing a song starting from chords. There are a number of different ways we can approach it, and this can also help us avoid burnout, because what happens is we start feeling frustrated and we hit walls sometimes when we've been producing a lot of songs or music, and our creativity starts to cycle itself and we start repeating ourselves. And by changing the way that you approach harmonization or songwriting, it can shake you out of that. And that's one of the techniques that I use to stay fresh. Last week, I talked about the Sarno Earth Drive, which is a drive pedal that I'm a huge fan of. I've been using it a lot in gigs. I just used it on the ska gig on Friday, not so much for overdrive, but for saturation, to just mellow out the transient of the Little King. The examples I recorded last week for the Earth Drive, I used the Tul G12 as my main microphone to capture those, and I want to play a rough mix of what I'm working on. I added a drum track this week and went to the Buddy Project recording studio with an assistant, Katie O'Connor, and we recorded drums for this, and which I'm still mixing, so you're hearing this in a non-complete state yet, but I want you to hear how the guitars are sitting using the G12 as my main microphone. They're sitting beautifully in the mix, and I'm not really reaching to EQ nearly as much as I used to. So I'm going to play the song, and then I'm going to solo the guitars and talk about them. We're going to listen to some of the guitar parts soloed now. The first one I'm going to play is from the bridge. I'm a big fan of bands like XTC and Gang of Four and Killing Joke and a lot of groups that were coming out in the early 80s, late 70s, somewhat calling it the post-punk era. It's not really a fan of genre names per se, but that's what they were calling it. If you're looking to find these bands, or you could just do a search on them, you're going to find a great collection of music and really interesting ideas. Just that I loved the sounds and the compositional ideas. I wanted a bit of that kind of vibe for this bridge guitar sound. I knew I wanted it to be bright, but I didn't want it to be harsh. And so this is where the G12 came in, put it dead center in front of a Vox AC15, which is a very bright amp. I had the bright switch off on the Tul G12, and then I used a Telecaster and a Retrosonic chorus, which is the original Boss CE1 circuit. Any saturation you're hearing was coming from the Vox AC15, which is an early 90s model. It was really a great era for the reproduction of the Vox amps. I know just about every model I've played from that time period I've really liked. They were being made at the Marshall factory, and this particular AC15, which I got from a good friend of mine, Kevin Bentz, is really fantastic. I'm going to backtrack a little bit to the second verse and show you a part that I was using the same guitar in the amp with, but I added in the earth drive for this sustaining arpeggiation part. I wanted just a little more saturation on it. I'm still using the Retrosonic chorus pedal, which is the CE1 circuit, Tul G12, center of the cone, bright switch off. Let's hear a very saturated fuzz tone using the Rush Pep Box that I paired with the Earth Drive to saturate the chorus more. So in the chorus, I have some guitars. I'm playing an SG and a Marshall and a Les Paul and a Marshall, panned left and right, double tracked, to give some of that real crunch and martially sound. That's run through the aux, and then the fuzz sound sits in the center to fill in with a little more saturation than the Marshall has, and that is using the Telecaster, the Pep Box, the Earth Drive into the Vox AC15 with the Tul G12 mic and the bright switch off. I was using the Earth Drive after the Pep Box just to soften some of the brashness that exists with that style of fuzz. I wanted the behavior of the Pep Box, but I wanted to make it feel a little more rounded. Check out the solo now. I was using the Earth Drive into the Solo Dallas Schaefer Replica Storm pedal. The idea here was stacking the two pedals to get a desired result rather than relying on one pedal. Sometimes I find using two levels of gain staging sounds more open and natural than trying to do all the work with one pedal. So for me, the Earth Drive was giving me some gentle compression and just taming the transients, giving a little saturation. The Storm, the replica pedal, was adding a little more limiting to it, so another stage of light compression or limiting, and a different type of saturation than the Earth Drive was adding. I just found that those two elements together really seem to work well together, and it's a combination I've been using a lot lately because they just complement each other well. That goes into the AC15 and with the Tul G12 on the center of the cone. I also used a Echo Rec plugin from Pulsar after the fact to create more of that washy delayed tone. I'd like to mention the rest of my signal chain. I'm using an API 312 mic preamp as well as a Purple Audio MC77 compressor. Not compressing much, it's just there to add coloration to the signal. I just find that everything sounds better when it runs through it. So I run through it, and sometimes like in my vocals right now, I'm adding a lot more compression than I am to a guitar sound that is being compressed by pedals and various saturation devices already. So the MC77 is adding a lot more tone and color to the sound more than it's acting as a compressor. And then running that into a Universal Audio Apollo, and that goes into Pro Tools. All my guitars are wound with DR Pure Blue strings. I really like the pure nickel sound. It's a little less brash, which is always someplace I'm trying to get to with guitar. I find that the pure nickels have a really nice round tone to them, but still have enough presence to give me clarity in a mix. Those are my go-to strings for electric guitar. For cables, I use a variety of either Vovox cables or Asterope cables or lava cables. In this particular case, I used the Vovox cables, which I really like. I do get picky about cables because the capacitance definitely makes a difference, and I hear it, and I tend to like higher capacitance than lower capacitance. I hear it, I like that extra, it feels like a faster attack and a little bit of a more presence to the sound than the lower capacitance, which seems to chop some of the treble off of the top end, and it almost feels like there's a little bit more of a lag to the signal, at least in my mind, and maybe that's just in the difference in the changes in the EQ curve of it, but I prefer the higher capacitance because it just feels faster and sounds a little more hi-fi. Well, I hope you've enjoyed episode 34 of Anatomy of Tone. Go check out Tul Microphones at tulmicrophones.com. I'm a fan. I think it's a huge upgrade when it comes to close miking guitar amps. I think I probably will never use another 57 for this job again. I mean, I'm definitely still going to use 2 mics on a cab and pair it with ribbons and condensers, but I don't know, like it does everything I want it to in a dynamic microphone, everything I've always wanted one to do. And so for me, this is something I'm always going to carry around to gigs and always to a session. Even when I plan a session, I'm just going to take it with me and be like, here, check this out, so they can check it out instead of using a 57 in front of a cab. If you have any questions, reach out to me at anatomyofguitartone.com, or if you're interested in taking lessons or having a tone constellation, you have questions about how to get your sound, you're struggling with it, I'd be more than glad to do a Zoom session and walk you through and find maybe some of the points that may be causing trouble for you and help you track down the sound that you're looking for. I will be back in 2 weeks for another episode of Anatomy of Tone. Until then, have a great time.